Shalom, I'm Chris, and let's follow Jesus along the Talmidim Way. We're calling this one the 12, and you might recognize the famous logo from the TV series The Chosen. It shows 13 teal fish swimming against the current. And as you may know, that TV show is about the story of Jesus and his 12 disciples. And it reminds us that in order to make a difference, sometimes in order to stand out, we have to swim upstream. We have to be different from the world. This section of Scripture is recorded in three Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Primarily, we'll be looking at Mark 3, 7 through 19. Matthew has these events scattered in Matthew 12, and then he'll go back to Matthew 10 for the calling of for the naming of the apostles. We're really following Luke's chronology. Luke is the one who set out to write an orderly account. He covers these events in Luke 6, 12 through 16. And it's going to be interesting that what the main event that Luke has after this will be the Sermon on the Mount, and that is something that Matthew records in chapters 5 through 7. So we believe Luke is the most chronological, and then we can see that Matthew is not really being chronologic at all. Acts 17:11 reminds us to trust but verify. Receive the word with great eagerness, but really through the power of the Holy Spirit, examine the Scriptures and let the Bible be the first commentary on itself that we choose and we refer to. A memory verse this time will be Luke 6:13, and that says, "He called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also named as apostles." So that word "also" is key in Luke. Sometimes we think of the 12 disciples as getting a promotion of sorts, and they're leaving their discipleship behind, and now they've graduated. Not really the case, because Luke says they also were apostles, and that reminds us that we are disciples. We are ones who are learning from Jesus, but we are also apostles. Out in the world, we are sent out to represent Jesus and put his interests above our own. So we've got this dual nature where we're learning and we're also representing. We don't stop being one in order to be the other. Our roadmap here will look at the crowds that follow Jesus, and that's a title of an article that is in one of my commentaries that talks about the different people that were in the crowd. Sometimes we think they're just disciples following him and people who were interested in him, but there are actually several different types that this article points out. We'll peek into that. Matthew will say this is another time that's spoken to fulfill an Old Testament prophecy. This is actually the seventh one that he lists. A lot of them are in the birth narrative, but he does sprinkle others throughout his gospel. Then we'll see that Jesus goes alone to a mountain to pray all night. And what I think he's praying about are two things. One, he's confirming his selection of the 12 disciples whom he's going to give additional job duties as apostles, as representatives. The other thing, and the Chosen picks up on this, is he is, I believe, praying for the Sermon on the Mount. He knows this is going to be a pivotal discourse, and he is crafting every word. Of course, he's God. He doesn't need to do a whole lot for it to be perfect, but he does pray about this, and he knows the impact this is going to have throughout history, which is why when we get to the Sermon on the Mount next time, we're going to spend 4 separate lessons on it. This is a map of Jesus' Galilean ministry. Remember, in Nazareth, he publicly proclaimed himself as the Messiah, and then that didn't go so well with the people, and he moved his ministry to Capernaum, and you can see that on the map right at the northern edge of the Sea of Galilee. He's wrapping up a trip of sorts throughout Galilee. We aren't told exactly where, but we know that he's been in and out of synagogues, teaching, healing, and having exchanges with the religious leaders. And now we presume he's headed back towards the Capernaum region. He's going to have his disciples secure a boat, and all the boats would have been in Capernaum or Tagba or somewhere in that vicinity. The traditional location for the Sermon on the Mount, which you can see is box 4 on the map, is in the hills right above Tagba, which is not too far from Capernaum. So all of this is happening right in a general tight-knit area here. Luke will record that he goes alone to a mountain to pray, and this could have been any of the hills surrounding that northern part of the lake, and we'll have some pictures of those as we move throughout the study. In this lesson, we're continuing the aftermath of the man with the crippled hand who Jesus healed. Last time we left off with Mark 3, verse 6. The Pharisees went out and immediately began conspiring with the Herodians against him as to how they might put him to death. So clearly these Pharisees did not like being publicly upstaged. They worked with the Herodians, which is a group they would have had nothing to do with otherwise, to put this plot into motion and to devise evil. So Jesus, of course, knows this is coming. He's in control of everything. He knows there's going to be a day where his earthly ministry will end, and he needs to think about succession planning and who's going to carry his message forward. And that's really the focus of this lesson. Jesus withdrew to the sea with his disciples, and a large multitude from Galilee followed, and also from Judea and from Jerusalem, from Idumea, from beyond the Jordan, and the vicinity of Tyre and Sidon. A great number of people heard about everything that he was doing and came to him. Perry Phillips, who wrote an article in one of my commentaries, said, "No Facebook, no Twitter, no news media, yet Jesus' reputation spread hither and yon, seemingly with the ease of modern communications technology. His reputation kept growing, astounding his friends and confounding his enemies." So Jesus has to balance his popularity with the fact that he needs personal time with the Father, and he also has a core group of disciples that he is training and pouring into. And so again, given this conflict with the Pharisees, he knows the clock is ticking, and he needs to raise up people who will carry on his work. And he told his disciples to see that a boat would be ready for him because of the masses, so that they would not crowd him. For he healed many, with the result that all those who had diseases pushed in around him in order to touch him. And whenever the unclean spirits saw him, they would fall down before him and shout, "You are the Son of God." And he strongly warned them not to reveal who he was. So we have the parallel passage in Matthew 12, 15, and 16. If you read Matthew 12, 16, it looks like he's telling the crowds not to reveal who he is, but Mark says he's expressly telling the unclean spirits to keep quiet. Jesus doesn't want or need the testimony of demons, even though they correctly identify who he is. So in this verse, we're getting a sense that a lot of the crowds they wanted to be near Jesus. And this, again, brings up that article I mentioned in one of my commentaries about the crowds that followed Jesus. So let's take a look at what that composition might be. Certainly, from the passage, we can tell that there were those who wanted Jesus to fix their physical ailments. And my comparison would be like your drain is stuck, and so you call a plumber, but you don't really have any deep relationship with that plumber. You just want that plumber to fix your problem, and then you go about your business. So I think there was some of that. There were probably those who were seeking and curious, so seeker-friendly. Maybe they say, "Hey, we've heard the Messiah is here. Let's go check him out and see for ourselves." So, good. Maybe they would transition into being disciples. Maybe they would say, not for me, and then they would check out after that. There were certainly people who wanted to be near a celebrity, and we definitely have this today. Fans, they want their selfie, and so to speak, and they just want to be part of the action, part of the scene, and kind of say, "I was there." Then you have that extra committed set of fans who today we call groupies. They want to be even closer, part of the action, but really they don't have a personal relationship with the rock star. They just want to be near the rock star. On the negative side, there were probably spies and informants that were recording his word and taking it back to the Romans, and looking for anything where that might be trouble, and where they would have to send the army in and put a stop to this. There were definitely people who latched on to Jesus to advance their own political or religious agendas. And actually, he's got a couple of disciples that may fall into this category, and we'll look at that when we go through the 12 disciples. There were certainly people who probably labeled themselves as Talmidim. They called themselves disciples, but they were reserved somehow. They would say, "Well, this is good, but let's not get carried away with this. Let's not get too close." And we're going to find that this group will leave when the going gets tough. But the smallest group is probably the truly devoted Talmidim, and this is the group that we want to be in. More than just the 12 disciples who are also apostles, but probably not as many as we might imagine. This is the smallest group that says, "Lord, to whom shall we go when the going gets tough?" And we hope that this is us. Matthew continues, "This happened so that what was spoken through Isaiah the prophet would be fulfilled. Behold, my servant, whom I have chosen, my beloved, in whom my soul delights, will put my spirit upon him, and he will proclaim justice to the Gentiles. He will not quarrel nor cry out, nor will anyone hear his voice in the streets. A bent reed he will not break off, and a dimly burning wick he will not extinguish, until he leads justice to victory, and in his name the Gentiles will hope." So again, another spoken to fulfill passage from Matthew, and as is his custom, He doesn't quote with 100% precision, but he edits slightly. In this case, he's quoting generally Isaiah 41, verses 1 through 4. The sages, in context, Isaiah often speaks of the nation Israel, and critics will point out that this has nothing to do with the Messiah, the Isaiah passage. But Matthew ties that together, and indeed the sages often conflate the nation of Israel with the Messiah of Israel. And so here Matthew is clearly saying that all of this is speaking of Messiah. There's a couple of references to Gentiles where Matthew uses it, but if you go back and read the Isaiah passage, it says nations or coastlands or islands. And in the Hebrew Bible, islands, coastlands, even the seas are used synonymous with Gentiles. And so it's interesting that today Israel borders 5 modern countries, and here we see the 3 to the east and the south, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, and Jordan. And then we've got Syria to the northeast and then Lebanon to the north. And it's interesting that all 5 countries have varying degrees of hostility to Israel. So imagine Israel's about the size of New Jersey. So imagine living in New Jersey, but you've got New York, Pennsylvania, and Delaware all have sworn to obliterate you and push you into the Atlantic, and a couple of them even have nuclear weapons. So that's kind of the modern situation for Israel. Matthew appears to be linking the fact that Jesus retreated with Isaiah 41, verse 2. He will not cry out, nor raise his voice, nor make his voice heard in the street. And Matthew substitutes quarrel for raising his voice in verse 19. So he's describing Jesus' meekness here, which is often defined as power under control. He's in control, but he's not going to be the conquering Messiah who's coming to overthrow the oppressors, not this time. And verse 20 hints of this. It talks about a bent reed he will not break off, a dimly burning wick he will not extinguish. So he is not coming to throw off the yoke of the oppressors, be Rome or the religious temple establishment. God in his infinite wisdom is going to allow these things to continue until the appointed time. And this is a good memory for us because, a good reference for us, because in our world, things are getting darker, and it's not necessarily the case that God's going to come rescue us. There may be a time where he's fulfilling his purpose and using this time of persecution. And actually, in the right at the end of the Roman period, the time of persecution was when the church grew the most and was the most active. So there is a sense where persecution builds believers. But there is that word until, and he will lead justice to victory. There is a day coming where Messiah will fulfill Jeremiah's new covenant, write the Torah on our hearts, will be fulfilled, and will be in the Messianic kingdom. Luke 6 says, Now it was at this time he went off to the mountain to pray, and he spent the whole night in prayer with God. So on the left, you can see the traditional Mount of Beatitudes, and you can see how beautiful it is with the view of the sea. And then another candidate for Jesus's mountaintop prayer spots would be Mount Arbel, and you can see that on the right. Again, another commanding view of the Sea of Galilee. So we've talked previously about how we need to follow Jesus' example and get that one-on-one prayer time with the Father. And as I mentioned earlier, he's likely praying over 2 decisions. Immediately, he's got the confirming of the 12 apostles, but he's also, according to Luke's chronology, he's about to give the Sermon on the Mount, or Luke calls it the Sermon on the Plain. So he's praying over these things, and the Chosen again portrays Jesus as crafting words, working actually with Matthew on wording and order and how his points are going to land with the audience and that kind of thing. There are a number of mountains and hills overlooking the Sea of Galilee, so we don't know what spot exactly Jesus went to, but it is fun to visit these places and wonder, hey, would you think Jesus was here? That kind of thing. The land is often called the fifth gospel because of passages like this. The gospel writers give us geographic details, which we can visit today, and it just fits the context of the words we read on the page and gives us a more complete picture of Jesus, and that's the fun of going to Israel. And when day came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also named as apostles. We talked about this earlier, how they were Talmidim, they were disciples and learners, but they were also, in Hebrew, the word would be shlichim, which would be apostles or agents, ambassadors, and sent ones. So they have this dual nature here. Eleazar in Genesis 24, which we are told is Abraham's eldest servant, he was an apostle. He was sent by Abraham on a mission representing his master Abraham. Another good term to think of this is an agent. So an agent is one who represents his or her client and has authority to speak on behalf of the client. And the agent must put the interests of his or her client above his own personal interests. Even if there's a conflict in that, then the agent has to go with the interest of client or disclose the conflict and step down. Any failure in this area is a serious problem, and it's called a breach of fiduciary duty, and you can actually be sued for this if you are an agent. Also, the agent's behavior reflects on the one who sent him or her, positively or negatively. So how we behave reflects on how people see Jesus. They're looking at us, and they should not see us. They should see Jesus. Conversely, any mistreatment of the agent is considered mistreatment of the one who sent the agent also. So our memory verse is Luke 6:13. When day came, he called his disciples to him, chose 12 of them, whom he also named as apostles. So Matthew and Mark do not pick up this word also, but I think it's good to remember that not only this is where we are in our narrative of selecting the apostles, but also of our dual nature, right? We're both learners and we're both representatives of Jesus. And when day came, also remind us that Jesus spent all night in prayer over this big decision, and that is something we should follow in his footsteps. Now, the names of the 12 apostles are these. The first, Simon, who is called Peter, his brother Andrew and James, the son of Zebedee, his brother John, Philip and Bartholomew, Thomas, and Matthew the tax collector, James the son of Alphaeus and Thaddeus, Simon the zealot, and Judas Iscariot, the one who also betrayed him. We're going to go through these, and I'm going to give you some of their history and some of the background. A lot of this comes from church tradition, but I think it's interesting, and kind of the point of our background lessons is to get maybe background that can help our understanding of Scripture. Simon Peter, always listed first in these accounts. You'll see that in his left hand he's got keys, and that references Matthew 16:19, where he is given the keys of the kingdom. So he's typically depicted with keys. He's the most senior of the 12, in status at least, if not in age. He's always the spokesperson of the group, and he often gets out in front of Jesus and has to be corrected here. Possibly he's the only one who was married. All of these guys were probably in their late teens or early 20s at the latest. So all these were younger guys. Simon is his given Hebrew name. Cephas means rock in Aramaic, and that becomes Petros in Greek and Peter in English. So he's got this connection with the rock, and there'll be that pun in Matthew 16 at Caesarea Philippi where Jesus says, "On this rock I will build my church," and it's a matter of debate who that is referring to. Is that Jesus? Is that Peter? Is that something else? Church tradition is that he was crucified upside down by Nero because he didn't want to be crucified he didn't think he was worthy to be crucified right side up the same way Jesus was. Note in these murals, and these all come from a church that's in Magdala by the Sea of Galilee, all of the apostles are given halos except one, and I'll let you guess who that one might be. James is depicted with a pilgrim staff, and hanging from that staff is a water gourd, which is like a canteen that was used by pilgrims. This is Yaakov or Jacob in Hebrew, and that becomes James in English. This is not the same James that we read about after the resurrection. That other James was Jesus' half-brother, head of the church, and author of the book of James. So this is a different James. John, the gospel writer, John, the beloved disciple, here he's depicted as beardless, along with Philip, and the only two apostles portrayed without a beard. He's the brother of the apostle James, and again, almost all conservative scholars believe this is the same John the apostle as the author of the Gospel of John, the epistles of John, and the book of Revelation. He is associated with Ephesus, and today his tomb is in Ephesus, although it appears that he and Paul were there at different times throughout the first century. He was imprisoned exiled to the Isle of Patmos during the Domitian persecutions in the late 80s of the first century, and that's where he received the vision and wrote Revelation. Now, we like to say that John is the only one who lived out to an old age and died of natural causes. But tradition holds that Domitian ordered him boiled in oil, but he was miraculously spared. So in that, with that in mind, all 12 apostles were martyred. It's just that John survived the attempt on his life. Peter, James, and John are the three of the inner circle, and they tend to form Jesus' executive team. Sometimes Andrew's included, but really it's the first three, Peter, James, and John. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, often depicted with unkempt hair and a long beard because he was an original apostle of John the Baptist along with John the Gospel writer. Again, he's sometimes included in the inner circle, but other than John 1, we don't have a lot of mention of Andrew in Scripture. Philip was a friend of the first four. They all grew up in Bethsaida. He's most known for introducing Nathanael of Cana to Jesus. And from this, we're reminded that we all need to be like Philip and bring others to Jesus. Tradition says Philip first carried the gospel to Greece. And note, this is not the same Philip as the evangelist in Acts 8. Bartholomew is a last name, interesting, because it means Bar Ptolemy, son of Ptolemy. And so he is depicted with a knife because the tradition is that he was flayed alive. And this reminds us that, again, all the apostles paid dearly for their beliefs. Standing up for and speaking the truth is not always welcome. John's gospel mentions a Nathanael, but never mentions a Bartholomew. So based on this, some scholars presume Bartholomew and Nathanael are the same person. Matthew, the gospel writer, the former tax collector, former enemy of the Jewish people, now becomes known for preaching the gospel among the Jewish people. And again, this is just an amazing turnaround. The early church historian Eusebius, who lived in the 3rd century, references a gospel of the Hebrews that was written by Matthew. And this suspects many to believe that our gospel of Matthew in Greek was actually a translation from an earlier Hebrew original. So it'd be amazing to find that original Hebrew version someday. Thomas, with his hand up, forever known as Doubting Thomas, because he missed a very important dinner appointment where Jesus showed up after the resurrection, and he didn't believe the report that Jesus was alive and appeared again. So his name means Didymus, means twin. I'm sure he would rather have been known as Thomas the twin, but history will forever record him as Doubting Thomas. James, the son of Alphaeus, James the Lesser, and it's interesting. We don't know a whole lot about him from the Bible, but probably in a way to make his character more interesting, the writers of The Chosen portray little James as having a physical impairment. They also portray Matthew as being on the autism spectrum, which is interesting. In fact, there's a powerful scene in The Chosen where James, with his physical ailment, approaches Jesus, who had just healed all these strangers, and he says, to Jesus, "Why haven't you healed me?" And this is a powerful scene for anyone like us who has had any unanswered prayer. And Jesus' response, according to the show, is your testimony with your complete faith, despite your healing, will be all the more powerful. So that's something to remember as we're going through our struggles. Luke calls Thaddeus Judas, son of James. Matthew and Mark call him Thaddeus. So he is another Judas, but he is not Judas Iscariot. In fact, John 14:22 calls him basically Judas. No, not that one. No, not Judas Iscariot. We don't know much about him, but apparently his staff references it's called a halberd head, and this is the weapon used by pagans to kill him. Simon the Zealot, what he's holding there is a hacksaw, and that is the symbol of his martyrdom, as he was supposed to have been sawn in two, not the quick way, but the long way, from head to toe. So they all had to pay a price. The Zealots were an anti-Roman revolutionary group, and he is one of those who perhaps latched on to Jesus and his following as people who might instigate a political revolution. Like anyone who has ever truly followed Jesus, we've got to learn to put aside what we want Messiah to be and really study who he really is. Over time, probably he became Simon, formerly the Zealot, because violent overthrow was just not who Jesus was and not what he was about. You have to see the humor in Jesus calling Matthew, who is a former tax collector, as an agent of Rome, and then Simon the Zealot is formerly someone who had sworn to kill any agent of Rome. And that just reminds us that no one is beyond God's reach, no matter how unlike us or how different from us or how opposite us, even how much an enemy that they are, Jesus can reach anyone. And then always listed last in every account is Judas Iscariot, and then he's always referenced as the one who betrayed Jesus. You can see he's holding the money bag here, references to John 12:6 and John 13:29. He also notably lacks a halo around his head, which all of the other apostles had. There's a body of thought, though, that believes he didn't necessarily have any ill motives when he betrayed Jesus, although it says eventually Jesus entered into him. But he just had a complete misunderstanding of who Jesus was and why he came. Like Simon the Zealot, he wanted, so the theory goes, he wanted to force Jesus' hand into being the conquering Messiah. And so by turning him over to the temple guards, Jesus would have invoked Matthew 26:53, where Jesus says, do you think that I cannot appeal to my Father, and he will put at my disposal more than 12 legions of angels. So Judas wanted to make this happen. Essentially, he was guilty of making Messiah in his own image and perhaps only focusing on the part of the Bible that he liked and ignoring the other part. So he focused on the passages that had Messiah as the conqueror, but ignored the passages that had Messiah as the sufferer. And of course, this is a warning for us because we have a tendency to do the same things. What's sobering about Judas is that even the chosen is going into this is that he is on fire for Jesus. He is sold out. He's a servant. He's loving every minute of it. But it's sad because he did not finish well. And so he then becomes a model of someone who can sit in church Sunday after Sunday, year after year, hear the word taught, maybe know the Bible better than anyone, have all of the outward appearances of being a believer and yet not be a believer. We're not quite sure what Iscariot means. Some believe that Judas was known as Iscariot because he was the man of Kerioth, and the word in Hebrew for man is Ish, so he was Ish Kerioth. If so, that would make Judas the only apostle who was not from Galilee. This place on your screen has been identified by some as the biblical Kerioth, and it's located around the Hebron area in Judah. And so it's again that painting him as an outsider, not just in terms of what he did, but all the way from the beginning, he was the only one not from Galilee. Another meaning of Iscariot could mean the Sicarii, which is another band of zealots known for striking their opponents with short daggers. So if he had a wrestling name, he could be Judas the Dagger Man. What reminds us to take note of Judas is that he did not finish strong. Our landscape, our Christian landscape, is littered with people who may have done great things but failed to finish well. And so we as Talmidim need to make sure we finish strong. We need, at the end of our days, to be able to say, like Paul said, I have fought the good fight, I have finished the course, I have kept the faith. And we do this by following Jesus' example of spending time alone with the Father, pouring into others, and of course, we are disciples of him, and we follow his words, which we're doing through this study. And this includes tackling the tough passages that we would rather not be there. And the Sermon on the Mount contains a number of those statements that are very, very difficult. But as disciples, we have to get excited about this, and we have to learn what Jesus was saying. And so I can't wait to dig into Matthew 5, 6, and 7 over the next several lessons and squeeze out all that we can. And not that we can win arguments or get head knowledge, but so that we may become better disciples and apostles for Jesus. So I'm going to close with the theme song from The Chosen, and we'll show you some pictures of these mountaintop areas around the Sea of Galilee. And we'll see you next time for Matthew chapter 5 when we begin the Sermon on the Mount.